Quite often, the most powerful and effective way to share our faith in the good news of Jesus with other people isn't to argue at people or weaponize Bible verses to beat people over the head with, but simply to tell your story, to say, here's what I've experienced, here's what I've lived through. And in listening to other people as they share their story, and then we share ours, it becomes a whole lot harder to reject that when it's one person telling their human, real story without necessarily attacking or weaponizing anybody or anything. We saw that in this last session in our study in the book of Acts. Most recently, we found Paul the Apostle as we turned into Acts chapter 22. He was in Jerusalem, the center, the hub of first century Judaism, where the temple is. He's come back from being out and about in the wider Gentile world, and he's trying to make sort of a goodwill tour to say, by his example and his actions, that this Christianity message that he brings isn't opposed to the ancient story of Israel and the covenants and the commandments and the Torah, but is somehow an extension or related to it. So he's there and trying to show that he's not attacking or preventing would-be Christians from keeping the commandments of Moses. He's just saying that if you're a Gentile convert, you don't have to do those things. But this has riled up a bunch of people in the city. They've seen Paul walking around the city with other Gentiles, and they assume he's brought them into the inner courts of the temple where outsiders are not allowed to go. And this has riled up the crowd and therefore has brought the Roman authorities into the picture. And the Roman authorities just assume Paul is some other troublemaker and they're looking to punish him for some other charges. Until Paul reveals to the Romans that he's not. He can speak Greek to them, and he's not some other Egyptian troublemaker or assassin or brigand that they had assumed he was. And then he says, could I speak to the crowd? So Paul now speaks in their language, in Hebrew and Aramaic, to the crowds, and he tells his story. It begins with, you know about how God sent Jesus. They had lived through those stories. They had some recollection, but then he goes and tells his own story about how he had been an early opponent and persecutor of the Christian movement. He's basically saying to this angry, riotous mob, like, I was one of you. I get it. I was there. I was convinced that this Jesus and his movement were dangerous, were heretical, were opposed to God, and I was rounding them all up. I was like you, and Jesus got a hold of me. The living, risen Jesus appeared to me and moved through some of his disciples to show love to me when I was their enemy. And he tells this whole story and then moves on to, it was that same Jesus who I was persecuting, who reached out to me when I was turned dead set away from him and brought me to him, who then also taught me, told me, commissioned me to bring this same invitation and welcome to even more outsiders, to the Gentiles. At this moment, the crowd has had it. Maybe it's the idea of a crucified and risen Messiah that finally pushes them over the edge. Maybe it's Paul forcing them to see that they've been acting like a bloodthirsty lynch mob like the one that had killed Stephen the martyr earlier in the book of Acts. Maybe it's the idea that God's good news could be shared with outsiders. Whatever it is, something reaches a tipping point and the crowd is about to go wild and to lynch Paul. So the Roman authorities step back in and they take him back into custody and they're about to flog him. This is sort of Roman justice, right? Sort of, we haven't proven whether this guy did something or didn't do something, but our way of administering justice is we'll flog him first and then we'll find out if he's done something worthy of it afterwards. But just before they do this, Paul stops and goes, you know I'm a Roman citizen, right? A citizen of the empire, that's something, right? Most folks that lived under the territory of the Roman Empire are just people that the Romans had conquered. They had to live under Roman authority with Roman soldiers marching through their streets, but without any particular rights as citizens of the empire. Paul says, whoa, you know I'm a Roman citizen, and they stop the brakes. I mean, while we might say you're not supposed to torture or flog anybody without charges, at least in the Roman Empire, you weren't supposed to do that to a Roman citizen without a conviction. And so the Roman authorities stop and go, hold on, you're saying you're a Roman citizen? It was very expensive for me to buy my citizenship. How did you get so much money? And Paul said, I was born a citizen. I was born a Roman. Again, depending on where you were born within the empire, some cities were outpost colonies of the empire. And if you lived there, if you were born there, you would also become a citizen by birth. So Paul sort of says, whoa, you're not supposed to be abusing me this way. He sort of pulls this ace up his sleeve that maybe he's been waiting for the moment that he can play it. And this changes things. Now, all of a sudden, the empire has a vested interest in seeing Paul go to trial. This begins to set into motion the chain of events that's going to eventually take Paul to Rome itself. Spoiler alert for a 2,000-year-old story. The book of Acts is going to end with Paul going to Rome, to the very heart of the empire, the capital of the empire, sharing the good news of Jesus there, where it will spread like blood through a heart and throughout a circulatory system. And on the empire's dime, they will have to pay for him to be transported and wait under house arrest, where the good news can spread from there. This is the beginnings of that moment. But what's worth noting here is how in all of Paul's conversation, even when things are very, very tense, he doesn't attack other people or say, you guys are the problem, you're awful, but he starts with a story of, I was like that. I've been in that place. I was the one who was opposed to God in Jesus, and I was the one who was turned away, and Jesus got through to me. Let me just tell you my story. Sometimes I think our most effective way of sharing our faith with other people is something just like that. We're not trying to argue at people or yell at them or condemn them, but to say, let me tell you the story of how God has shown up in my life. And that also means admitting all the ways that we've messed up and that God's love reached out to us anyway. Same way Paul tells his story. I was completely turned away from God, and that didn't stop God. God got a hold of me even when I was the enemy. And that invitation is there for all of us as well. We're going to keep moving on through the book of Acts, so join us here in these next several weeks as we get to the last several chapters of Acts. Join us around the table at 1 o'clock on Thursdays. If you can't be there in person, catch up with these video summaries, and we hope you'll see you along the way.